Liberation Spirituality Part 2. I graduated from Yale Divinity School in 1981, and that was the same year that Henry Nouwen left Yale for South America on his year-long spiritual pilgrimage. We thought as students it was an amazing thing for a tenured professor as renowned as Henry Nouwen to, after 10 years of teaching at Yale, to give up tenure and to leave the institution. Henry left Yale for Latin America to practice solidarity, to live and work and pray among the poor. It was a movement of downward mobility, he called it, and in response to liberation spirituality. Henry was interested in liberation theology, and so he enrolled in Gustavo's course in Lima in 1982. He says in his journal, "I remember this course as one of the most significant experiences of my 6-month stay in Latin America." I want to read you some excerpts from his journal, published as Gracias. "I was part of an unusual learning event," he says, in which approximately 2,000 pastoral agents, he called them, participated in the course. These people had come not only from all the districts of Peru, but also from Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, Argentina, Panama, and Nicaragua. These young men and women had lived the Latin American reality, had encountered the Lord, and had drunk from the fountains of living water flowing from within it. Most of them, he said, were born and raised in poor barrios and had become activists and had learned to think with one eye on the gospel and one eye on the painful reality they shared with the people. They were all deeply immersed in the Bible and had come to think of themselves as the people of God, called to the promised land. Henry continues, "The way in which these young Christians spoke about their Lord was so direct and fearless that it became clear that their pastoral work among the poor was not based on any mere idea or theory, but on a deep personal experience of the presence of a loving God in the midst of the struggle for justice and peace. There was joy and gratitude. There was warm friendship and generosity. There was humility and mutual care. And these gifts of the Spirit empowered them to be Christ's witnesses among a suffering people." What surprised Henry so much was that the liberation theologians in South America were motivated out of a love for their Lord, a love for God's people, not out of an ideology or a theory or a social movement, but out of a personal relationship with God. So often, people get caught up in a social movement. They commit themselves to an ideology. They commit themselves to social justice for its own sake, rather than out of a deep well of living water that comes out of love for God and gratitude to God and love for each other. Without such contemplative experience, social justice, he says, becomes shallow, ideological, anger masked as social justice. In Peru, Henry learned how to hear God's voice in the voices of the poor and oppressed. He says, "Although I had gone there hoping to be able to give, I found myself first of all a receiver. The poor with whom I lived revealed to me the treasures of a Christian spirituality that had been hidden from me in my affluent world. While having little or nothing, they taught me true gratitude. While struggling with unemployment, malnutrition, many diseases, they taught me community. And in the process of sharing their struggles, I discerned my own vocation." Well, in dialogue with Gustavo, Henry learned some important lessons. He learned that liberating spirituality must, first of all, be rooted in an active and reflective faith, and not a passive or private or privileged contemplative practice. Prayer and social protest, contemplation and social justice for Gustavo go hand in hand. It's not contemplation versus activism, it's contemplation in action. Contemplation and action, one without the other, is not true spirituality. Gustavo taught Henry that a true liberation theologian is not just someone who thinks about liberation, but someone whose thought grows out of a life of solidarity with those who are poor and oppressed. Liberation theologians do not think themselves into a new way of living, but live themselves into a new way of thinking. Action precedes reflection, rather than the other way around. So through dialogue and friendship with Gustavo, Henry's contemplative spirituality got radicalized, got activized, and he was never the same. Henry writes this in his journal. Talking with Father Gutierrez and his students that summer made me aware how individualistic and elitist my own spirituality had been. In many respects, my thinking about the spiritual life had been deeply influenced by my North American milieu, with its emphasis on the interior life and the methods and techniques for developing a prayer life. Only when I confronted what Gustavo calls the eruption of the poor into history did I become aware of how spiritualized my spirituality had become. It had been, in fact, a spirituality for introspective persons who have the luxury of time and space needed to develop their inner harmony and quietude. Gustavo's spirituality of liberation does not allow for such reductionism. You see, what he's saying here is that you can become so introspective, so interested in your own interior life, your own journey of faith, that you forget about the struggle of existence outside yourself. When we romanticize the gospel, for example, when we read the Magnificat, Mary's song, as a sweet song of Mary for Christmas time, we only see poetry. We only sing a song. But the poor help us listen to the Magnificat with new ears and recognize the revolutionary power of Mary's words. God has deposed the mighty from their thrones and raised up the lowly to high places. God has fed the poor with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. These themes are informed by historical realities of the time and prophetically point to future struggles of the people of God. When we remember that Jesus was executed as a subversive by the political powers of his time and died under the accusation of being the enemy of the ruling class, we are able to understand why Pilate placed above Jesus' head the triumphal charge, King of the Jews. Can we be true Christians without being considered subversives in the eyes of the oppressors? In the story of the Last Judgment, about the separation of the sheep from the goats, these are not individuals. These are nations. Nations are subject to the very judgment of God. What have you done to the least of mine? United States of America, what have you done to the least of these? How have you treated the most vulnerable? This passage of judgment in Matthew 25 does not simply refer to individual poor people and individual rich people who neglect the poor, but first of all, to the nations. For God loves the poor, has a preferential option for the poor, and holds the rich as a class, holds the powerful as a class of people, holds nations responsible for how they treat the most vulnerable, not just materially, but also emotionally, psychologically, physically. To care for the poor means much more than to reach out to people who need food or jobs and clothes and a safe place to stay. It means to care for nations that are crushed by the forces of history and live under the oppressive burden of being ignored or exploited by the international community. I think of Rwanda, Syria in our time. Although Henry remained critical of some aspects of liberation theology, what impressed him most was how Gustavo integrated mysticism and activism, the struggle for spiritual growth and the struggle for political freedom, the mystery and the clarity on when to act, when to wait, when to be led. Although Gustavo remained critical of a purely personal or private, individualistic spirituality, which he sometimes saw in Henry, he centered his own activist faith in a deeper spiritual and theological reflection. And the dialectical fruit of Gustavo's more activist faith and Henry's more contemplative spirituality is a hybrid, if you will, a new kind of liberationist spirituality reflected in Gustavo's "We drink from our own wells" and Henry Nouwen's foreword to the book. Together, these two priests offer the world fresh resources by which we can dip deeply into the well of our own lives to discern the ongoing liberating movements of God and discover our own vocation in the world and what we are called to do.